And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to GeekWatch, a subsidiary of the monastery, the open bar of the internet. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have one, two, three good brothers. Ha 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 ha.
Four.
Four. Yeah, clearly I can't count, and I'm falling on bad habits.
No, today I'm a ghost. It's fine. I no longer exist.
You're a ghost 90% of the time. That's why you're always late and gay.
Hi-oh!
I set myself up for that one. I'm not going to complain. I'll just go ahead and drink.
No, I'll do you one better. You walked into that like a rake, sir.
Oof.
One more of that, and we'll have to call you Sideshow Bob.
Oh, now that's just mean. Also, well played, sir.
Welcome.
Well played.
Moving on.
Yeah, making his debut into the holiest of temples. The man who will not be screaming "Open my heart." The one and only Cure Crystal, better known here as Cure Kenny.
Hey, everybody!
We also have the living stack of comic books, the Eye of Sauron, and the man who, for once, is not late and gay this week. Good brother Doku. We have the man taking over all of your anime, who just recently finished the biggest JoJo-thon that ever posed in any sort of JoJo. Good brother Shades.
Yada does it.
And last but certainly not least, we have the man of 1,000 runes and the CEO of Zidare Enterprises, good brother Xanatrix.
Hey, I think we are just about to make that 1,000,000% breakthrough. So anybody who wants to sign some of these release forms for testing, we'll pay your next of kin really well if anything goes wrong.
No! I'd rather take a contract from QB than join your company.
But Cure, I'm not Guy, so clearly I'm better.
Yeah, you sure about that, buddy?
120,000%.
So
Okay, real quick before we get started, my tweet about the GeekWatch got a like from an unexpected friend.
Oh,
Shelby.
Oh shit!
Did not expect her to like the tweet.
Haven't seen that name in a while.
Yeah.
So a bit of background thing. I am still processing the fact that I somehow managed to get friggin' Guru Larry into the temple. I don't know if that's a case of luck of the gods or managing to out Lucky. Then again, that's not exactly hard to do.
Speaking from experience as someone who actually had talked with Guru really on a regular, like I was actually almost friends with him at one point, a long time ago, back before he had actually gotten bigger on YouTube. He is one of the most approachable motherfuckers you'll ever find. So yeah, it actually didn't surprise me you got him.
Yeah, he was pretty chill. There were some parts of the interview that were trickier than others, simply because there were sometimes I would cast something to feed and I wasn't able to get exactly the kind of follow up. I ended up because of it being his main focus, a good chunk of that interview revolved around fact hunt and just trying to do research and the like. So
makes sense.
And I'd covered some other stuff. We had dipped into a little bit of some of the weird and obscure of 90s gaming, and how amusing it is that something like the Commodore never really got a foothold in the States compared to when it got a foothold within Europe, within the UK and Europe.
The Commodore was more a hobbyist thing.
That and the fact that the video game crash of the '80s didn't really hit the UK the way it did the States. And it's speculated that that what ended up saving things was the ZX Spectrum,
Mhm.
which I could certainly see. Um, and and of, but I'm trying not to let that particular interview go to my head. Um, I'm having 50-50 luck on that. Um, as I mentioned earlier, given how we did the episode about the Brotherhood effect a few weeks back, um, I I went through the first 10 episodes of the Orphan remake, which somehow manages to out Brotherhood. Not in the sense of being a better or worse anime, but more in terms of how quickly, how long it takes before it starts veering off in a different direction. As the Orphan that I saw growing up and the actual source material are very far removed from each other.
A vast difference. Yeah. A very vast difference. Yeah.
Like I'd say it took what about 15 or so episodes before Brotherhood started veering off from what came before.
Partly, I know that it condensed basically all of the first half of the 2003 series
Mm-hmm.
into like the first 6 episodes of Brotherhood.
Yeah. Orphan started veering off within the first episode.
Which makes sense considering that Sorcerer Stabber Orphan as a source material, as I said, was vastly different from what we got many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it really wouldn't make sense to even start from the very beginning, except for maybe a few things.
And for what it's worth, I did make a decision to watch the dub, mostly because I know that David Matronga was fighting really hard to get on it when he caught wind that something was going down. So I was glad to see that he got his wish.
I swear, every time you bring up the Brotherhood effect, the only thing I can think of is the Escaflowne anime versus the movie.
We're not going to get in. Don't. You just touch. Why did you do that, Doku? Why?
Because I'm an evil bastard. It's the Eye of Sauron.
That's like one of the monk's reverse scales when it comes to anime. Why'd you do that?
I apologize for nothing.
Well, let's just get to our
Silent
topic tonight,
rage.
shall we?
Yeah. So this week's topic is dubbed "The Fantasy That Ain't." I will freely admit that I had Voltaire in the back of my mind when I came up with the title. And this is something that's been a pet peeve of mine for the longest time, but it recently flared up about a month ago. Because here's the thing. People have, in my opinion, and some of you can back me up on this, people have a very limited and very wrong view on what counts as fantasy fiction. Whether it be in game form, whether it be in anime or manga form, or whether it be in video game form.
Book. Even
You
just normal
mentioned-
novels.
I want to back you. I want to back you up, Mildred, but I do have to ask the question.
Shoot.
Define exactly what you mean by fantasy fiction. I think that's a good place to start.
When I'm referring to fantasy fiction, I'm referring to the totality umbrella of high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy, and swords and sorcery, and everything in between. Even more hybrid genres that are doing a fantastical twist on another genre, like say the Weird West or Weird War II kind of stories.
Okay, so would you agree with me if I said that Game of Thrones is not high fantasy?
Yes. Game of Thrones is at its most charitable. You could say it's either it is on the low end of fantasy. I however will not say that it is swords and sorcery.
I I would say it's low fantasy simply because access to magic is so scarce.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly internalized tribally amongst very few people.
Yes.
And magic does exist, but it's mostly an uncontrollable force at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It has
Well, the reason. Sorry, go ahead, Ted.
I was going to say it has all the fantastical elements of a fantasy, obviously, but it's not high fantasy because magic use and other fantastical elements are not commonplace and integrated into society.
Yeah.
Which is one of the hallmarks of high fantasy.
Well, and I would make the argument that it's actually fantasy fiction because those elements, as you said, are so sparse and not really used except when they're relevant to the story.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is based on some sort of historical event, and it's only the fantasy magic elements that come in when appropriate. So I would argue that it's historical fantasy or fantasy fiction, just because they go out of their way to explain that magic is that scarce, where it's really just it's just a recounting of history with some sort of fantastical twist on it, but it's really just nothing more than a retelling of the War of the Roses.
Of course, even with that, I can't really make too many judgments regarding A Song of Ice and Fire because it's still not finished, and it's probably not going to be finished until I'm dead.
Or he's dead. I would hesitate to call it historical fiction by any account of the measure, because when it comes to historical fiction,
Mm-hmm.
you don't generally see something like the War of the Roses then being transplanted into a new world setting with new rules behind it. If it were historical fiction, it'd be more like taking the War of the Roses and transplanting people into the War of the Roses that weren't there, changing a couple of things behind the scenes without changing the broader historical...
What, so like that Duel Roses game on the PS2?
Oh god. Oh god. Has someone played that game? Good god.
I'm gonna disagree with you, Zan, but that's a topic of conversation for a different day, and maybe we can save that for another stream. But I'm gonna let Mildred get back on the rails. But I do disagree with you.
Now,
There's also the spectrum of also Western media that also deals with stuff like high fantasy or fantasy, like cartoons and movies as well.
The East-West thing here is not a factor in this.
We're talking about all of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this admittedly has been a pet peeve of mine for most of my life, and especially most of my life that I've been heavily involved with storytelling in one form or another. But it recently flared up, like I said, a month ago because of the reaction to the announcement of Final Fantasy 16. Now, putting aside how good or bad or what have you the reveal trailer was, that's inconsequential. What I want to focus on is the fact that people were unironically stating, and I know this wasn't an isolated case because I get info from a lot of sources, as you guys know. They were saying and praising to high heavens that Final Fantasy was returning to its medieval fantasy roots.
And this reaction has actually occurred multiple times throughout Final Fantasy. And I think it always occurs with more vehemency after we have something that people would consider less fantastical of a Final Fantasy. After 8, we got 9, where even the advertisement and marketing said a return to Final Fantasy's roots.
And everybody but me seems to have forgotten why they went with the style that they did for 9.
I loved the style for 9.
They had specifically said it was because this was going to be the last mainline entry with a single digit in its title.
Yeah,
so they wanted to do a bit of a send-off.
Yeah. And then
I would be remiss if I didn't point something out. We're talking about a series that was titled Final Fantasy because they expected it to be the swan song, where Square didn't think that they were going to be able to actually be a viable company anymore. So it was their last hurrah, and for
Not
whatever
Square,
reason,
not Square necessarily. Sakaguchi specifically, who outright said, if this doesn't work, I'm quitting game design and I'm going back to teaching.
Yeah, this is more Sakaguchi than Square as the company. It's been expanded sort of into its own myth at this point.
Yeah.
But we have to point out, even for the company, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. So if Final Fantasy didn't succeed, we wouldn't have Square Enix right now. So it is
Square Enix.
It is
Square as a company would likely still exist because I believe they were also on other corporate levels besides just entertainment. So
well, it would have been absorbed by Sony. I'm not going to get into the financial politics of things because that's a complicated discussion. That's economic. Yeah, it's economic based, and I'm not going to get into that.
We're digging too deep into the trenches on this one now.
Yeah. But then we also, like, recently this entire chain of games, starting with 13. 13, by no stretch of the imagination, is close to what most people consider the norm for Final Fantasy, or I should say most casual players of the games, the people who aren't as immediately invested as people such as ourselves.
Well, that actually touches on the point that I wanted to actually bring up regarding how it was supposed to be a swan song, where this game became where it was supposed to be just a one-off, and whether it was successful or not was irrelevant. And then it spawns this entire franchise where you can go from fantasy, whether it's medieval, Eastern, or something entirely unique in and of its own, to being sci-fi fantasy. What has Final Fantasy not done?
Well,
every iteration, every different game that they come out with, it's something different. Well, and I actually do applaud them for that.
While they do innovate with their games and try to, we'll get into how none of the games have ever been medieval fantasy later.
Yeah, that's the focus here. Is that now? I have had people claim that I'm a little bit too much of a stickler for definitions when it comes to genre. Something that I typically hear when people get on me for my issues with the term JRPG. But the reason I am that much of a stickler is that we need aside from the fact that as nerds we like to categorize and compartmentalize things. That's just part of the game. But there's also the fact that when discussing these sort of matters, these sort of hobbies, clear boundaries and clear guidelines do need to be established.
And that's definitely important, because if we're going to talk, like, going back to Game of Thrones and the question that I proposed, without rehashing it, if you can't clearly define something, like, where does it fit in the genre? Is it science fantasy? Is it science fiction? Is it high fantasy? Is it low fantasy? Is it historical fantasy? There are clear definitions that we should at least address, because we like to consume certain things, and I can guarantee you right now, with using anime as an example, I don't want to watch something that I'm expecting to be a fantasy, and all of a sudden it turns into a harem etch or each. We like definitions because we don't want to get to the 5th, 6th episode and realize, like, oh yeah, this isn't what I expected it to be, and I don't want to keep watching it. I just wasted my time. We like definitions.
I could name some examples, but I'm not and say how dead.
That works. So the last point I wanted to make about the run of games we've had recently, 13 is definitely more of a science fantasy, especially with things like time travel that is partially scientific, and all throughout its series. and the 14 being an MMO has obviously a mishmash of multiple different types of fantastic genres within it, because that's just how it's going to go. Most MMOs tend to mix genres pretty heavily. And then, of course, 15 was nearly modern fantasy, especially with how Insomnia is portrayed.
I hate to bring this up because I hate using this word, but it is actually appropriate for the topic. There is intersection when it comes to fantasy, because there are elements of science fiction or medieval fantasy. There's always certain elements that do bleed over into different genres, so there's always that gray area, and which again is why we like definitions. But we like it to be well defined because we want to know what the emphasis is going to be. We understand that there is going to be crossover. We understand that there is going to be certain elements of science fiction, hardcore fantasy, whether it's high fantasy, low fantasy, or basis in actual history. We get that. But we do like those clear definitions, specifically because we want to know what we're getting into before we actually invest the time into it.
Yeah. And so we've had this long run right now of things outside of the normal, quote-unquote, mid to high fantasy that is normally, quote-unquote, again, expected of Final Fantasy, which is why when so many people saw 16 and the casual people who aren't as invested in these definitions are like, return to the roots, it's medieval fantasy roots, and caused people like Mildred and myself to cringe. It was like a million nerds cringing, suddenly snuffed.
Now,
Yes, I'm paraphrasing.
I will freely admit that the reason why I cringed comes back to a mantra that I have had for years, and that is nostalgia has no pedestal. I do not want any sort of nostalgia that I might have for people, places, things, etc. to color my judgment of something, to try and be as objective as possible. And obviously, true perfect objectivity is something that is impossible, but it's still a mountain that is worth striving towards. Now, the reason why I took issue with the whole we're going back to his roots is, first off, I would go so far as to say that the people advancing that kind of thing are relying on a third-degree impression of what they think Final Fantasy was, especially in the SNES era. I'd imagine that a lot of the people making that claim probably haven't touched a Final Fantasy game since 6. Maybe 4 if I want to be generous. And
I guess we should talk about what the first Final Fantasy game actually was.
High fantasy. With a mix of a little bit of steampunk.
That I've come to use for a lot of console style RPGs coming out of Japan that are very much in that vein of whether it be Final Fantasy, whether it be the Tales series, whether it be Suikoden, whether it be Dragon Quest, is fantasy gestalt. It is not one particular style of fantasy. It's a hodgepodge of elements from several.
Yes.
My point about the first Final Fantasy game is it didn't fit into what we would like, where, as we were saying earlier, a clear definition of what type of genre it was. You have your mage, but you also have, no pun intended, your monk. And so you have different elements of fantasy all wrapped into this one game, where it's ultimately just telling you the story of the hero's journey, and you go through, and it's a fun, entertaining game. But it's not really grounded in. It's not trying to be a specific type of genre. It's just an RPG fantasy story, and they're just telling the story from start to finish, and that's all it was about. And you could apply that to 2 and 3, the ones that weren't released in the United States. But that's all the point. That's all the point was behind the game. It wasn't trying to actually fit into a genre. It was just a fantasy game where you played through. Here's the story, start, end, finish. And in my opinion, that's actually what made the Final Fantasy games really good, is because it didn't try to stick to a specific genre. It was what it was, and it was entertaining as hell.
With Final Fantasy the First, you can tell that the pillar that they built their Gestalt from was high fantasy. Especially that class system in the very beginning seems pretty heavily influenced from popular tabletops of the time as well.
I would say not necessarily. I would say the tabletop influence is second or third generation. Because
it's secondary, yeah, but it's still there. You have to keep in mind
that the reason why that sort of thing is in there is because of how popular wizardry was in Japan.
Yes.
Wizardry and Ultima.
Yes. But wizardry and Ultima also had their inspirations. Exactly. It's a secondary or tertiary understanding, but it's still there. The influence is there. And the reason high fantasy is the central pillar, magic is commonplace. So commonplace, in fact, they sell it. And it's not really medieval fantasy, because not every place is a kingdom and not every place is medieval in its particular theming. So you have the high fantasy core, and then they just started building from there. And that's how 1 went. 2 did its own thing. It was a revitalization. Did some very interesting ideas, including being able to break the game in the first 8 hours. The first instance of the Disc 1 nuke. And then 3 was the first implementation of the job system, trying to really find a way to make the game pop and grab people. Because at that point, Final Fantasy in Japan was second fiddle to Dragon Quest.
Well, also something that we have to point out about Final Fantasy, especially the first game, is it's very easy to pick up and play, because when you have a white mage, a black mage, a red mage, a warrior, a monk, you know exactly what type of roles these characters are going to fit into, and it doesn't require a lot of backstory. It's very easy to pick up and play, and that's part of the reason that high fantasy is popular.
Doku. First off, rails. The pick up and play thing. That's beside the point. Getting to a more sane thing. Something that I think needs to be pointed out is, for a lot of people who are doing the whole back to their roots thing, I want to point out the irony that the 2 entries that most likely were their introduction to something like Final Fantasy and console-style RPGs as a whole,
4 and 6
have more in common with either a very steampunk fantasy aesthetic in 6, or a very urban and very almost Blade Runner-esque aesthetic in 7.
I would actually make the argument that the urban setting was commonplace throughout the series, because even in Final Fantasy 1, all the way up until I stopped playing around 11, 12, but you still had those types of urban settings. It's just the flavor changed.
Yeah, but 7 was very diesel punk. 7 was very diesel punk.
Yeah. You have a very post-industry aesthetic with 7, and that's what I'm focusing on. the people who were talking about a return to roots got into the franchise when it was doing something that at the time was seen as very risque. Like, I distinctly remember seeing a lot of magazines talking about how much of a high risk gamble it was for something calling itself Final Fantasy, and stressing the fantasy part, to be going with a setting that ostensibly looked modern.
Well, I mean, I guess then we have to ask the question: what defines being a fantasy, and also what defines the roots of the series? Because
I would say when it comes to the first part of that, the roots part, not the first part, the second part, the roots thing, it is doing that gestalt, and I'd say nowadays it's more of an emphasis on the mythology that's developed. Like, can you with every there's it's not a set of hard and fast things, but a series of bullet points that you look at that and you instantly know. Like, if you see a ice spirit who's manipulating snow everywhere, you're immediately going to think of Shiva. If you see a castle that has light beams all the time, you're going to think of Alexander. You see
a dragon.
Yeah, you see the great dragon, you're going to think of Bahamut. And in the same vein, the victory fanfare theme has largely been consistent throughout the entire series. The emphasis on crystals and the crystal theme has been largely consistent. There's always some presence of orbs or crystals in any of the games.
As a side note, can I just say that the sweeping arpeggio that is the prelude to the crystal theme is possibly the greatest stroke of genius Nobuo Uematsu ever had, considering he wrote it in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I can definitely go with that. But like even when it comes to series outside of that, if I were to try and do the whole fantastical roots with, say, a new Suikoden, which is never going to happen because fuck you, Konami. That game barely qualifies as high fantasy as it is because of its source material, the water margin, also known as All Men Are Brothers. When it comes to something like the Tales series, that's gone all over the place so many times that it's looped all of the places twice, and as if they're repeating around the world in 80 days. You could probably make the argument of being a Dragon Quest gestalt with the original Tales of Fantasia, but then you have to deal with the other can of worms, which is the fallout of Wolf Team.
Mm-hmm. Then there's also Symphonia and Vesperia.
There's a lot of stuff to cover between those two, but for those unaware, Tales of Fantasia was created by Wolf Team, which would later split into Tri-Ace and Tales Studio. And the creator it was based on the novel that he had written, which, unless I'm mistaken, has never been translated into English. And he was not happy about the changes that were made to the original novel when it came to this adaptation, and that's why there was the big falling out when it came to Wolf Team, and why that company ended up splitting in two. He ended up forming Tri-Ace and would later go on to create the Star Ocean series, while the remainder stayed behind as Tales Studio, and the rest is history. And
that's actually a good point, because when it comes to games like this, especially ones that are grounded in fantasy, when you're developing a game that is a fantasy game, whether it's science fiction fantasy or sci-fi fantasy, sci-fi / fantasy, or just high fantasy, low fantasy, you have a distinctive world that you build, and the characters operate within that world. And Final Fantasy is kind of strange in the aspect that the world game to game changes not just drastically, but fundamentally. And from game to game, it's very rare that you actually see a Final Fantasy game where you could consider it a direct sequel, unless you want to do like a Legend of Zelda connect the dots. And even then, Legend of Zelda still has its, off-shooting story arcs and plot lines and how the world changes based upon did the hero win or did the hero not win. With Final Fantasy, you might go from medieval to science future fiction. And that's both a strength and a weakness, because Final Fantasy is kind of all over the place. It allows it a lot of flexibility, but at the same time, it doesn't, like you were saying earlier, when they say a return to roots. Well, what is the roots of a Final Fantasy game? Because as far as I see it, there's no real distinct, hard line format for what a Final Fantasy game should or shouldn't be.
Yeah.
There isn't a hardline format, but as Monk mentioned earlier, there are elements that you expect to see or at least hear mention of in almost every Final Fantasy.
Yes.
Orbs or crystals are one. The theme, certain musical themes, such as the prelude and the victory theme, even if they don't sound exactly the same, they're there. The idea of certain summons being in certain ways and having certain names.
But see, those are like hallmarks. Those are call signs that defines the brand Final Fantasy. But as far as the game setting and the story setting and the characters themselves, you can do pretty much whatever you want, as long as those hallmarks, those watermarks, those stamps are there that define it as a Final Fantasy game. You can pretty much do whatever you want.
Which is what Tactics did, especially with the entire world of Ivalice. It replaced a bunch of things that were hallmarks of Final Fantasy, except for a few key things. I mean, the summons in Ivalice are not called by any of the normal summon names.
Yeah.
And that's actually what I love about the Final Fantasy franchise, is you don't have to stick to a formula. Zelda has to stick to a formula. Final Fantasy, as long as you have those defining factors, you could set it pretty much however you want, which, ironically enough, it's funny that they call it Final Fantasy. It's almost a beautiful accident, because no matter what game it is, no matter what setting it's in, no matter what the characters are, as long as it has Final Fantasy and then you get the da-da-da-da-da-da-da, like, it's Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
And it works no matter what way you try to spin it or present it to the consumer. You know it's Final Fantasy.
Now that said, I do want to shift into a little less video game end of things and more into how fantasy is used in anime, because unlike say video games or books, from my perspective, when it comes to anime, you do have another form of this gestalt, in the sense that, I'd say a good chunk of a lot of fantasy anime tends to have a bit of a, for lack of a better term, anachronistic vibe. Like, as I mentioned earlier on during the preamble, I've been watching Orphan, the remake, and even though it's very much set in a semi high fantasy setup, the only reason I can't go full on high fantasy is that while magic is commonplace, it's not like anybody can use magic. You have to be of certain bloodlines in order to be able to use sorcery, or you have to have some sort of connection with one of the dragons. And admittedly, Orphan has a very loose interpretation of what it refers to as dragons in this sense. But even with that, you have some degrees of modern tech. You have some clothing styles that are definitely not of era, and so on. I'll use another example that might raise some eyebrows on this as well in Naruto. Now I know some of you might be rolling your eyes that I'd be using Naruto as my example on this, but consider the technology level that you see within that particular setting. Like it despite the focus on ninja, you have very modern technology sprinkled throughout the place. I mean, for fuck's sake, we have friggin' pachinko machines because of course we have to have pachinko machines.
It's Japan.
It's
Jinx.
That's a drink.
One, it's Japan, and two, at the very least, I'm not seeing the mentor character for a certain Sentai, thinking that pachinko contains the mysteries of the universe.
Oh,
God damn it! I do not need that reminder. I gave you for that.
That's a drink and not a grateful one.
Yeah.
No, agreed.
But you've got that. You've got friggin' power lines all over the place. I'd actually say and I know whenever I bring this kind of thing up, I've had some people say, what about Demon Slayer? Demon Slayer is far more period appropriate. Because it outright name drops that it takes place in the Taisho era, which is around the 1920s.
Well, and I know I was talking about this earlier off stream, but Golden Kamui does the same thing. I can get past that as long as it's period appropriate
and it makes sense. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Demon Slayer Golden Kamui, it makes sense because that's what you expect to see.
Yeah.
Now, if you're say, 3,000 years in the future and all of a sudden dragons start showing up, a little bit different.
Could still be done though.
It can. Well, it has been done. But
I mean, we're not talking Drakengard here. Let's not get into Yoko Taro's mind at this point.
No, I'd like. Look, the only thing that I'd ask is to see if he really does have a compartment to hide Snickers bars.
You doubt him on that? Why would you doubt him on that? He clearly does. The man, it's clear that the man is always insane, which means that that's his normal way of thinking, and he's never grumpy or sane, which means he's never hungry. So he always has a Snickers on hand.
Yeah, well, joke's on you. Those Snicker bars are actually Twix.
Look, all I know is that he doesn't have to worry about me stealing his bars because I can't eat it.
Anyway, you were going something with this, Mildra?
Yeah. When it comes to fantasy in anime, well, first off, something I do think we need to make clear is when it comes to the idea of fantasy anime, and this is also the reason why I named Naruto earlier. I don't think I should be expected to have Record of Lodoss War be the comparative benchmark for what's going to qualify as a fantasy anime.
Mildred, let's be honest. Lodoss War is a hardcore, the same way that Goblin Slayer is hardcore D&D, so is Lodoss War. It sticks to a very, very specific formula.
Okay, let's go with something else. Let's go with Rune Soldier.
I'm not going to comment. I'm just going to say I'm about to drink after I make my point.
I do
When
have,
it comes,
there is actually one show that I don't know if it classifies as fantasy in your eyes or not, Mildra. And some of you may probably know where I'm going with this. Fairy Tale.
Honestly, yes.
yeah, no, that's actually a really good example. And it actually feeds into what I was about to say. When it comes to how Japan views fantasy, they have a very loose definition of it. So you might see
I'd say it calls.
traditional.
Not sorry to cut you off, Doku, but I'd say it comes back to that Gestalt thing. Like when you look at a lot of the ones that we've discussed in the last 40 minutes, a lot of them aren't necessarily trying to emulate a specific genre, but bits and pieces of different genres and using that to create a combined whole. And I'd say this is a very cultural thing because let's look at the religious picture within Japan. You have this hodgepodge of elements of Confucianism, Taoism, traditional Shintoism, and Buddhism.
Well, Mildred, I'll actually give you some really good ammunition for that argument. Let's look at Danmachi. You have traditional Japanese, you have Western cultures, then you have Greek and Roman gods all just mixed into the same story. And yes, it does work, but it doesn't follow one specific thing. It's just a pick and choose for what works when, where, and why.
Also,
And
Zeus is
you
probably
see
trying
that
to bang all of them.
No, Bell's not trying to bang any of them. He's scared. Let's.
But Damachi is a really good example of seeing how at least Japan views the fantasy genre because they like to pick and choose elements and they don't care about whether it fits into a certain checkbox. They just use whatever it is they damn well please, let's be honest. And that's why this conversation gets a little convoluted and where we're trying to define what is fantasy
So
becomes a somewhat contentious argument because that's not the way Japan approaches it at its whole. Because as long as it's fantastical, that's really all they care about.
Yeah.
That's actually not true. This is going to be a bit reductive. I did look up a few definitions for fantasy as a genre. Fantasies hallmarks, the thing that define fantasy as fantasy. It's a speculative fiction, usually set in a fictional universe, and somewhat inspired, varying levels, by real-world mythos and folklore. And it's distinguished from things like sci-fi and horror by having the absence of excessive scientific advancement or excessive macabre elements, but there can be some overlap. The reason Danmachi, and for anybody who's listening that doesn't know what Danmachi is it okay to pick up girls in a dungeon? The whole thing is clearly inspired by real-world folklore, with gods such as Takemikazuchi from Japanese folklore, and Hestia, and gods from all across the mythoses of the world. And the whole point there is that they are drawing the inspiration from real-world folklore. It definitely falls under the fiction umbrella at that point. The same can be said of other anime, video games, books, that even going back to the entire root of this conversation, Final Fantasy, they are inspired by folklore, both Eastern and Western folklore, things about spells and magic and dragons and Sagin and the mer people, And all of these different elements, whether they're small or large, build up into these fictional worlds to create a fantasy world. It's no one. There's no one real thing you can point to and say that is what fantasy is. Again, just like with the Final Fantasy games, there are certain elements that add up to make a game a Final Fantasy game. With fantasy itself, there are specific elements dealing with real world mythos and folklore that add up to create a fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Now, but even with that, there's I still even when I look in the non-Eastern end of the spectrum, there's still a large contingent in our own necks of the woods that have a very skewed approach, and this is where a bigger crux of the issue comes up. Is people seem to, and I'm pretty sure all of you can relate to this. People seem to have this idea that in order for something to qualify as fantasy, it has to be very British, i.e., very Tolkien-esque, very either British or very Western European.
And looking at some of the definitions I found, one of which was off of Wikipedia. Wikipedia notes that with fantasy in pop culture, the fantasy genre predominantly features settings of a European medieval nature. Mm-hmm. And when medieval is a link to their article about actual European medieval ages, Arthurian, Celtic, Dark Ages, etc. That's what leads to medieval for them. So that's the predominant idea is influenced by popular culture.
Well, I guess that's something we should...
Hang on. Cure?
So Ben, you looked that up on Wikipedia. Buddy, I don't see flutter here.
Ah!
I said that was just one of the multiple definitions I went to. Excuse me, I go a little bit further than flutter.
Oh, okay. moving on. No, something important to point out is fantasy from the definition and the way that people perceive it is that medieval European style, which we know is not true, but it is popular. And I guess that's where we run into why we're even having this conversation in the first place, is because, yes, dragons and castles and knights wielding swords, that's the popular definition of what fantasy might be. But then you have things where it still has the elements of fantasy, but it's not knights versus dragons in a medieval setting. Mm-hmm. So for lack of a better way to describe it, I suppose we should go back to the number one question of let's define what fantasy actually is. It has a grounding in some kind of something that might resemble reality, but it varies and strays far enough that it does become a dream or an illusion or a fantasy, something that isn't real, but mirrors reality just enough that it's believable, but it has elements of things that we know don't exist in the real world and will never exist in the real world, like magic. But it's believable enough that it makes sense within that somewhat realistic world. So, yeah, you might have your European-style dragons, but you might have your the Asian-style dragons. Maybe you have airships. Maybe you have, people who actually do understand magic and they can split themselves into to two parts, and that's their trump card. And so I guess really, if we're talking about fantasy, and this again going back to Final Fantasy as a good example, whether it's set in a medieval setting or whether it's set in a futuristic setting, it has enough grounding in reality that we can believe that within this set world, within the rules that are defined, even if it's loosely defined, we can believe that this might exist. We believe that someone might be able to create a fireball, or might be able to split themselves in two, or might be able to summon Bahamut or Alexander or Amos. Within the settings of that world, no matter how fantastical it might be, within that setting, it makes sense. And that's what makes it a fantasy.
Yep.
So you're saying that there's a basis for it. However, depending on depending on people's definition of it, it can be interpreted in different ways, shape, or form.
Oh, exactly, and that's actually a very perfect way to describe it. It has to have some type of grounding in reality to the point where the fantastical, I would never believe this to be true, actually becomes believable within the setting. And that's, in my opinion, that's what a successful fantasy does. Because, let's be honest, amongst all of us here, if we were to walk outside and I was going to tell you, oh yeah, dragons exist, you're going to look, or the sky is green, you're going to look at me and say, no, you're crazy. But in a fantasy setting...
Fuck you, I look at you like you're crazy anyways.
Can't really change the way we all look at you, Doku.
I'll just go ahead and drink for that and continue to live in my fantasy. But that's the point about being a successful fantasy, is it has to have some type of grounding in reality. And if it doesn't achieve that much, if it's not believable, it's not successful.
Mm-hmm. This is also why the importance of rule consistency is something that I am a very big stickler for. As plenty of you know, you've all seen how much I've flipped my shit whenever a given story establishes rules and then breaks them. And hi Reiki Kawahara, how you doing? And fuck you too. We'll get to you eventually.
We'll eventually get to the worst writer and game designer ever.
Oh, if I could bring
we're not going to focus on him this week, but believe me when I say his time is coming.
A reckoning is upon you, Reki Kawahara. Look forward to it.
Let me know when that day comes, because I need to buy at least 2 24 packs.
May I please get a word in edgewise?
Go ahead.
If I could bring a friend of mine in here, I would. Because, oh boy, he had some things to say about Reki Kawahara.
Oh, well,
I think most of us do.
To that I say, take a number and get
in line.
As there's a long line of people who want to kick his ass. So pretend that you're at the DMV or your regional equivalent.
Wait, I'm not Patty and Selma.
Oh. The sad part is, I would like to think of how to defend it, and I can't. I really can't play devil's advocate on that one.
You can't defend the indefensible.
No.
Look, we can do a lot of things here in the monastery, but we do not work miracles.
I was about to say. I was actually about to say we're miracle workers, not literal gods.
But if I were to use I'd say if I were to use another major example of of establishing rules and then breaking them, and even though this is going into a bit more of a comic book thing, I remember getting really pissed off at the inconsistency regarding the other Kryptonians in Man of Steel.
Dear, you're about to make me be very, very, very upset.
Yep.
More so than usual.
Drink a little bit more, Doku. You'll feel better.
We have to ride for the drinking anthem.
No,
not yet.
Thank you.
Keyword, yet.
but when it comes to those sort of systems, and I will note that I've been reading Stormlight Archive, recently, which, for the record, I want whatever drugs Brandon Sanderson is on.
Dude, Brandon Sanderson is so good. Maybe he doesn't need drugs. Maybe he actually does have magic.
And he's done a lot. He's spoken a lot on magic systems, and to that particular end, and this is something that we semi answered given the discussion about Game of Thrones. But can you have a fantasy setting without a magic system?
Yes.
Yeah,
All right,
I don't
that's
see
it.
why not.
Yeah, I think that's. I think that very much settles that. Although I think you certainly can have magic equivalent things. I mean, I'd classify Full Metal Alchemist as a steampunk work, even with the quote unquote magic that is alchemy. It's still treated like a science, which is why I got
Exactly.
I got people really pissed off at me when I made Edward a warlock in that character build.
No, it's
Yeah.
they say it's scientific, but it's goddamn magic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, alchemy is supposed to be based off of the residual energy coming off of the movement of tectonic plates, but because of Father's, well, fuckery, it's actually based off of philosopher's stones buried in a giant circle. And then with the alkahestry from Xing is supposed to be from the flow of chi of the tops of the mountains to the bottoms of the valleys, which is outright magic. It's all just goddamn magic.
Mm-hmm.
It's just they say it's science.
The thing of it is that
Doku, hang on.
Yeah, the thing is that we're acting the argument is like, does fantasy require magic? Does it have to have magic to be declared as fantasy? No, because it is merely one element of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many other things that classify a series as fantasy outside of magic that you don't need to require it.
Yeah.
This way, there are plenty of Greek stories of the heroes fighting monsters where no magic is involved inherently. It's just man versus monster. The monsters are the fantastical element there. And there's like, sometimes not even the gods are really mentioned, other than the fact that the gods are mentioned in everything, and it's not like their direct involvement. There's no...
Yeah, it's more of just like, it's more of just worshiping a deity more than just the deity actually existing. Even if the deity doesn't actually exist, they worship it because, well, that's what you did back then.
Mm-hmm.
You praised Zeus, even if Zeus didn't actually exist.
Thank you, Zeus, for not striking my farm with lightning and catching everything on fire. Thank you, Lord Poseidon, for getting my my boats through the fucking Mediterranean Sea without anything dying.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Well,
Also,
a better example of how magic and science is treated, and I'm going to go to one of my favorites on this one. Look at how Outlaw Star treats magic and science. Specifically, look at how they treat caster shells. Do we know exactly what Tau magic is? No, we don't, but we can at least determine two things. One, there is some sort of energy that we call magic that can be manipulated by people through
Various means.
And then through those manipulations, we can put that into what is a shell that can be fired through a gun, which is why we have caster shells. Yeah. So the blending of magic and science, Outlaw Star does very well. But that's why I say Outlaw Star is...
It's science fantasy. It's not just science fiction.
Yeah.
Especially with things like the galactic ley line and a bunch of other stuff. But
that's also the reason why I've put stuff like Star Wars in the realm of science fantasy, or even space opera, which is a whole other beast, that
whole other thing. Yeah.
One of these days. Although if we do get to space opera, I may have to replace the opening theme with a certain song from Flash Gordon.
Also from the whole technology and magic thing. Do I need to quote the Quark 3 laws?
Well, I was actually about to make the point that Outlaw Star's whole thing combining magic with technology is both Clark's third law and the third law corollary. Clark's third law being any science significantly advanced enough is indistinguishable from magic, and the corollary being any magic significantly well studied is indistinguishable from science.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
go ahead, Sam.
The few magic users who remain at the Hot Springs planet to create caster shells, they very clearly understand the source of their magic, how the magic works, the processes thereof, and how to put them into caster shells. But they're the only experts that remain.
Oh, and that's actually the reason I like how Outlaw Star treats magic and science, is because despite the fact that we're living in an extremely advanced society, casters and caster shells are considered old and obsolete.
It's outright referred to early on as old magic.
Yep. Old magic and legacy technology type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Which it's very Warhammer 40k style, but I actually like that. I think that's the better approach because, as you said, any technology that's significantly advanced enough is indistinguishable from being just advanced or magic.
When you mentioned 40k as an analog, I'm going to assume that you're bringing up the tech priests.
Partially, yes.
Yeah. That makes me wonder if Gene ever prayed to the machine spirits of his caster, whether they'd give him they'd let a dud shell actually fire in the end.
No, because you have to keep in mind that Gene is the unluckiest son of a bitch in the entire galaxy.
Or is he?
I'm gonna let Doku walk. I'm gonna let Doku walk into that one. Thank you.
I will walk into that trap because you know what? He ran into Hilda. He found the most advanced ship in the world, and he ended up with probably the most eclectic and unlucky crew, but the crew he didn't deserve, but the crew he did. Either way, it is one of those weird things where Outlaw Star does it very effectively. Any normal person would say, yeah, nah, fuck this shit, I'm out. But it works for Gene Starwin and Gene Starwin only.
Yeah.
But that's a completely different topic of conversation. I'm just more focusing on the way they treat magic and technology in Outlaw Star is very clever and very appropriate, and that's why I say it's science fantasy and not science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Then again, I'm still waiting on someone to explain in episode 2 how the hell did that guy make an energy dragon? Because whatever he's smoking, please give me some of that.
I think when it comes to those sort of drugs, I think Masaki Yuasa has that on lock. Mostly because of the fact that his animation style is drugs.
You're not wrong. He's been smoking Dragonite.
Yeah. Now, I do want to
ground up a Pokemon to smoke it?
I do want to use a couple
Damn it, I was thinking the same fucking thing.
I do want to use a couple examples of this whole fantasy misunderstanding outside of Japanese media. There are two examples that always end up coming to mind for me when it comes to how people misunderstand fantasy and popular fiction. Now, the first of this is from an old classic when it comes to PC-style RPGs in Planescape. I distinctly remember people talking on forums that Planescape was too weird to be fantasy.
Okay.
To take a line from our buddy Zeltrax,
Excuse me, what?
Yeah. Now, for those unaware, one of the main themes with Planescape is this massive metropolis called Sigil, which is an intermediary place for every single world, plane, and demi-plane in D&D's multiverse.
Mm-hmm.
It is the living example of Metropolis in its classic definition, the mother city.
Mm-hmm.
And all of it overseen by the Lady of Pain, who is a case of don't fuck with that.
Oh, but why not? They say not to stick your dick in crazy, but
Don't disturb the natural order.
Nothing bad will happen ever. By the way, stick your dick in that.
You won't be able to live long enough to regret it, because at the mere thought of even trying to do that, you're gonna end up having a few dozen knives sticking out of you. Also known as the Roman Handshake.
AKA hold my tear.
Yeah.
it's only the Roman handshake if it's 32 times.
Oh no.
Yes, the old Julius Caesar method.
What, you think he was the only one who got it?
Well, that's what most people assume, but me, no.
Hold my mulled wine.
But when it came to Planescape, now I do think some of that is just a consequence of people getting into the idea of doing D&D on PC through Baldur's Gate, which was a fairly standard affair for its source material. But Planescape is still very much a fantasy work, but it is far more on the abstract end of things. Especially when you consider that a lot of the motifs that are within what someone would expect to be fantasy don't exactly apply. One of the least of which examples being the main character as literally referred to as the Nameless One, or the fact that you have the most against type example of a succubus in Fall from Grace.
Okay, I'm gonna give an example in regards to fantasy, and I'm not sure if this is going to make me the target of a lot of ire, but I'm just gonna go with it anyways.
Try me.
You can't tell me that something is or isn't fantasy simply because a claymore, a scimitar, and a katana exist within the same medium.
Well, I mean, a claymore, a scimitar, and a katana exist within the same medium in real life.
See, that's my point. There's a lot of people that would look at fantasy and say, well, wait, there's a gladius and a claymore, but then you also have a katana. Your point? It's a fantasy. You could easily have those types of weapons in the same setting, but because they think it should always be a certain type of setting, then it's not qualified as fantasy, which is bullshit.
Yeah, this is a case of like the idea for most people tends to be the stereotypical idea of what a fantasy is. They think, knights and dragons and elves and all that kind of, that's what they see fantasy as. But what a lot of these people don't get is that fantasy is such, fantasy as a singular word is such a broad term that encompasses so much that literally at least 80% of our media out there could be classified as some form of fantasy.
Yeah. And incidentally, that's also the reason why I separated into smaller nets in the form of high, low, dark, etc. Because obviously, I'll use some recent examples. I'm not going to be, if somebody were to ask me to run a high fantasy game, I'm not going to be breaking out Shadow of the Demon Lord. If somebody wanted to play if somebody wanted me to recommend them a fantasy RPG, I'm not in the same vein as high fantasy. I'm not going to be giving them a copy of Diablo 2.
Yeah.
Gothic fantasy.
And the same and in the same vein, if somebody was asking that, you wouldn't stick them with with Castlevania, although maybe you'd stick them with the original Castlevania just to watch them suffer.
No, if you really want to make them suffer, Castlevania 3.
Oh, good lord, I put horror story.
I mean, if I'm going to make people suffer, I'll go switch Genesis and just give them the original Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2.
No pun intended with mine.
Wait, Genesis?
I meant Master System, I think. Yeah.
For once, I'm not the only one that said Ninja Gaiden.
And yeah, I've heard about the Master System Ninja Gaidens. Oh.
Yeah, the original Ninja Gaiden games.
Go play Battletoads, damn it.
Guys, rails.
Mm-hmm.
Rails.
But even with that, now when it comes now, obviously the difference between high and low fantasy is the amount of grit and the amount of operatic elements within it. Whereas sword and sorcery, obviously the big examples of that is stuff like Conan, Kull, and Solomon Kane. Go ahead.
Where I was going to say things like sorcerers are very, very sparse. Magic users in general are sparse.
Well, not only are they sparse, but they're also treated with a strong degree of mistrust.
Well, it's because they can do things that the common man can't trust.
Yeah. But
I mean, Mildred, let's be honest. If you could sit there and say, "Hey, you see this stick real quick? Yeah, I'm gonna turn you into that 57th gender," you probably wouldn't trust that person either.
No.
I just seem to make Disney references.
Oh, I'm just gonna bite my tongue on this one and just go ahead and drink my beer.
But when the thing about something like swords and sorcery is that it is very low tier on the end of things. You're not generally going to see a save the world story in a sword and sorcery book.
Mm-hmm.
Like at most you might see a save the kingdom, and even with that you're going to need a whole lot of prodding. Like consider the speech that Max von Sydow's character had to do in the first good Conan movie.
Mm-hmm.
I say first good because I do like the 2011 movie, but that's a whole other story. But it took him so much prodding just to get him to even consider doing that. And even with that, it was less about when you look at that particular film, it was less about saving the kingdom or the region or whatever. It was more about fucking up the person who fucked up his life and effectively made him go into slavery.
I would make the argument that if you want to compare what high fantasy is to a sword and sorcery,
Mm-hmm.
Goblin Slayer is sword and sorcery. If you compare it to a Record of the Lodoss War.
Record of Lodoss War was very much doing a high stakes affair, whereas I'd say even with some of the larger implication arcs with Goblin Slayer, it was still localized to a specific region. I think the closest thing to a major huge threat was the whole thing with the aqueducts, and even with that, the focus wasn't on saving the city or saving the kingdom, but more on the fact that Sword Maiden knew the risks and did it anyways because of her own issues.
Well, the reason I actually make that comparison
is because if you look at Goblin Slayer and what the end is, and spoiler warnings in case anybody actually cares, even the final, the quote final boss in Goblin Slayer, it's still just a goblin, and you're still fighting it with, adventurers who, yeah, you have your mages and you have people who are, would be considered overpowered, but it's still just limited spells and swords, spears, and you're still fighting goblins. Versus at the end of Lotus War, you're talking about a mage who has been possessed by a witch who is trying to sacrifice an elf to resurrect a literal demon that wants to destroy the world. That's the difference between, high fantasy and sword and sorcery.
No, except Doku. You forget that there's a B plot arc in Goblin Slayer talking about the hero that went and slayed the Demon King. They even show up for the festival.
Yeah, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that.
No, that absolutely destroys your point. Goblin Slayer is definitely a high fantasy setting with a focus on a rural area. So you don't get a lot of the fantasy. You don't get a lot of the same fantasy elements you would if, say, Goblin Slayer had stayed and adventured in Watertown instead of the border town where Cowgirl and Guild Girl all live.
Well, and so I'm going to give you pushback on that. I'm sorry, Mildred. I'm going to be very quick. The reason that I say Goblin Slayer is sword and sorcery and not high fantasy is because, unlike Lotus War, you don't see that fight against the Demon King. You don't see, the three heroes go and defeat them, and yet you don't see that big epic fantasy battle. You just see the dude who's running around with a sword, and then when it gets bloodied enough, he just drops it and picks up another one and continues to fight goblins. You don't see that high level of epic fantasy, Tolkienian style fighting. It's hinted at, yes, and it does exist within the series.
But I'm gonna before you guys get completely off rails, I will note one thing specifically. The end of that, the end point when it came to that arc, and this is the reason why I'm gonna have to outvote you on this, Doku, and after this I want to move on to getting back on the rails. Is the fact that the central thing was Goblin Slayer being willing to open up to actually rely on other people, culminating in him, even though we don't see his face, it culminates with him taking his helmet off and everybody else seeing that, hey, there's an actual person in there.
Oh, yeah, if I remember correctly, there was someone who was betting if there was actually a woman or not.
Goblin.
Yes.
There were some people betting he was a goblin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Either way, I stand by my point. I'm not going to argue it.
Last side note on my end, I'd just like to point out that of the 5 people in Goblin Slayer's party, 3 of them are magic users.
Even if their magic use is very limited.
It's Vancian. Their magic is Vancian.
As if I needed one more reason to hate Vancian magic.
Yes, I know.
Anyway, guys, I'm heading out. I'm fading over here.
All right.
See you, Shades.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Thanks for stopping by, Akir. But when it comes to the other example I was going to give, and this is something that's also stuck in my craw, is I have had people argue to me that I need to put a separate category of fantasy for games like Legend of the Five Rings.
Why?
Doku, are you familiar with L5R at all?
Vaguely, not very familiar, but
it's extremely Eastern inspired. Extremely Eastern inspired. And if you wanted to make a qualifier, you could say Eastern fantasy, though that's reductive and too broad to the point of being useless.
Yeah.
You mean the same thing I could make the argument about Western fantasy?
Exactly. That's kind of our point here.
Yeah, and this also ties into the reason why I never use the term JRPG if I can help it. Because consider this: if we're going by the RPG from Japan approach,
Bloodborne,
fuck it, we'll go with all of the Souls games are in the same are in that argument in the same category as as Disgaea, Dragon Quest, the Tales of series, Star Ocean, and Final Fantasy.
Well, that's the thing. If you're gonna try to make that argument, the only argument you're making is that it has a stylistic and a certain stylistic element and a certain aesthetic.
But then
But outside of that,
those aesthetics have spread to almost all of Eastern Asia. Korean and Chinese game makers have the same types of aesthetics that people once only ascribed to JRPGs.
Hi, Magna Carta.
Specifically, what I'm
Genshin
what I'm talking about. Well, specifically, what I'm talking about is the way that the game and the environment is presented. If it looks a certain way, then it must be this.
But we have Western places that make things in anime-esque.
And that's the ironic point, is because you have a lot of these quote Western fantasy style games, things like Dark Souls, coming out where it has the Western aesthetic. It looks like medieval Europe, but it's coming out of Japan. Whereas at the same time, you have games that have an Eastern aesthetic, like Ghost of Tsushima, but they're made in the West.
Oh God, I love Ghost of Tsushima so much.
I wasn't even going to go with Ghost of Tsushima in my example. I was going to go with Septerra Core.
Septerra Core is another good one, yeah.
Septerra Core is another good one. Games like Battle Chasers and Grimshade also very much qualify.
Well, so I guess my point real quick, just to wrap this one up, because it's a very quick point.
Yeah. Just
because something has a certain type of aesthetic, it doesn't mean it's Eastern or Western. It's still fantasy. Mm-hmm. So what's your point?
Another example that I'd like to bring up in this is The Witcher.
Inspired entirely by Polish myth.
Yeah, I know that certain people want to do the whole it ripped off Moorcock, which cry more.
Again, that brings me back to my question. What's your point?
Yeah. When it comes to something like the Witcher, I've often argued that one of the key things to that particular work's popularity is the fact that it was doing a style of fantasy that isn't often seen up until that point, because, as I mentioned, a lot of people have the assumption that that fantasy has to be very British, and The Witcher obviously is not.
Super Polish.
Another example I'd like to go into when it comes to that is Tekumel.
Okay.
Which Tekumel by M.A.R. Baker, which I've had one of the guys who's worked on a tabletop adaptation with Jeff D. Tekumel is a very fascinating setting that it definitely leans on the science fantasy end of things, but it has far more in common with a more Middle Eastern approach.
Well, and Barker, much like Tolkien, was also interested in societal functions and conlangs for his world.
Pretty much. It's a lot, and I do have to correct myself when I made the Middle Eastern comparison, because
it's more Urdu.
A lot of it is inspired by there's some Middle Eastern, but a lot of it from Mesoamerica, Egypt, and India.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty big Mayan influence there from the Mesoamerican part. So,
also when you look at a lot of for example, in regards to fantasy, and I know this is delving into horror as well, but if you look at how people interpret or at least present the Necronomicon, it's not Eastern, it's not Western, it's very much Middle Eastern. And
even though the name Abdul El-Hazred is not how that name should be written.
No, exactly. But that's the thing with the way the Necronomicon is presented as a book, as a story. It's very much strongly influenced by Middle Eastern mythology. It's not Western in the sense that it's European. It's not Eastern in the sense that it's Chinese or Japanese. It's very much a Middle Eastern mythological representation of fantasy, because that's what it is. And the same thing goes with people talking about Wendigos or the Wolfmans in North America. It's not European. It's not Eastern. It's not Middle Eastern. It's a distinctly North American thing, especially when it comes to Wendigo. Even the rake, if you start talking about that, no one talks about the rake in Europe. They don't talk about it in the Middle East. That's a distinctly North American thing. So for people to say like, oh, well, it's not fantasy because it doesn't have this element, because it's not stylized in this way, that's just not true. It's not stereotypical. It's not the pop culture. It's not the pop culture viewpoint of you have to have this particular stylistic element. Okay, you got your dragons. I've got my Tengu. Why is this one fantasy but this one isn't? It just doesn't make sense. It's a very short-sighted. It's a very narrow way of looking at things.
I'd say this ties into something that I've said when it comes to my tabletop experiences over the past 20 years, and that is that I firmly believe, more so than I did 20 years ago, because of what time does to one's experiences, that Dungeons and Dragons is a horrible introduction to role-playing.
But it is the most popular, and that's why everybody hears about it.
Oh, it's
the key word is popular.
Yeah.
Whenever it comes to that, first off, I had already lambasted the difference. I had already made clear in the previous video the difference between something being popular because it's good and something being good because it's popular. But even with that, consider how you can vary. If we're gonna go with the whole popularity thing, consider how you can very clearly tell the difference between an actual fan of a given medium, like say anime, and someone who's just writing a trend.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the big tells of it is what they're going to focus on. If they're only focusing on, say, DBZ or Hero Aka or Pokemon, probably, and to the exclusion of most other things, or barely touching other things, poser. If they'll go into specifics about what they're watching, what they like, what they don't like, not a poser.
Mm-hmm.
And again, ironically enough, especially with mediums like anime, anime tends to mirror Western culture more than it does Japanese culture. Yeah, you might get things like Demon Slayer, where it does mirror Japanese culture, especially for something that's time period specific. But for the most part, you look at a lot of anime, and it mirrors Western culture. But then you look at animation here in Western society, and it's Lord knows what it's trying to mirror.
Let's not go into the bean mouth shit.
I was also going to say, Doku, that what you're stating is more watching what it tends to make it to the U.S. If you look at anime in general on Japanese syndicated television, we get maybe, well, before simulcasting became popular, we got maybe 10% of all anime that were produced yearly. Now we get, closer to probably a quarter. But if you look at a lot of the anime that comes over that isn't as popular with Western audiences, but is still super popular with Japanese audiences, there are a lot of anime that deal with Japanese themes.
Mhm.
Most of the slice of life anime are Japanese themed. A lot of, ironically, mystery anime or 4-Koma-esque anime are Japanese themed. So the theming of it being Western might be more what they're a marketing tactic for them breaking into Western markets. They think, oh, well, this type of anime here will probably be more popular with them than something that's slice of life or 4-Koma or something. And yet, of course, everybody and their mother that knows anything about anime loves Azumanga Daioh.
Well,
And
that's fair,
Nichijou.
and I'm not gonna give you too much pushback, but I will bring this one point up.
Okay.
So, in regards to Japanese anime and the target audience, yeah, you have a point, and I'm not going to say you're wrong because you aren't. But let's look at what Japan is producing versus China, and how they produce their shows, because you can see there is a strong difference between what Chinese animation is producing versus Japanese. Japanese tends to be more heavily influenced by Western culture, and it has to do obviously with geopolitics. I'm not going to get into that, but when you look at what China is producing, if a certain show is produced by Japan or if it's produced by China, because it's strongly rooted in a certain type of culture, and specifically in the way that the show itself is presented. And it doesn't have anything to do with the language. It has to do with how the story itself is presented. It's Chinese because it's rooted in Chinese culture.
If there's one, I think if there's one thing that we're dancing around on the matter is the fact that it is very much folly, to the point of being as much folly as sword fighting a fart, to look at to look at a XY approach when it comes to it. And this is when Cure had earlier brought up the whole East-West thing. The reason why I shot that down is, one, I'm casting with a wide net here, and two, given how we have at least two generations of crossover influence on both sides of the fence. The idea of trying to divide an East and West becomes more and more impossible. And I'm not saying this is in some sort of mug globalism kind of thing, but more of the fact that you have entire generations who grew up watching different anime, and that influenced them in artistic endeavors. And you have the same thing over in Japan and in other places. They were people who were inspired by works within the quote unquote West, and that played a factor into their artistic inspirations. So,
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and play devil's advocate against my own argument. Even if China is producing its own animated series, even people in China are still eating Big Macs and drinking Coca-Cola.
but that's getting into a bit of the politics of the matter, and I'm gonna knock that part down.
Oh yeah, I'm not going to go into it. So I just wanted to make the point. There's going to be influence regardless. But you can tell like what the influence is, and you can tell like when a Chinese animator produces a certain show, you can tell it's produced by China the same way that you can tell it's produced by Japan, the same way you can tell it's produced by Europe. I mean, France is a big one when it comes to their animation.
Oh yeah. Even if a good chunk of it we don't end up getting, or we get much after the fact.
It's actually rather unfortunate because I forget the name of the series, but even France has produced some really, really good animated shows that many people would think came out of Japan, but
Wakfu.
nope.
I've heard people talk quite a bit about Wakfu, but I've never had the chance to see it.
Actually, pretty good.
It's definitely worth a watch. Mm-hmm. It's not the best thing in the world, but I would give it an 8 out of 10. I don't know how you feel about it, Zan, but I think it's solid.
It's a pretty solid show. I would have to rewatch it to give it a better rating because I haven't watched it in a while. But from what I do remember, it was pretty good. I liked it.
Now, this is largely the reason why I say that when it comes to that whole most popular thing, when we mentioned D&D earlier, if somebody wants to just ride the trend like that, okay, more power to them. However, once you decide to start making qualitative statements and that's your background, don't be surprised when I or somebody like me decides to hoist you by your petard. Because Lord knows I'll do that for free.
Mm-hmm.
And that was largely the reason why I got so mad at people doing the whole we're going back to its roots thing with Final Fantasy 16. Or I suppose if I want to use another example of this whole strangeness, consider Numenera, which I've seen some people finagle about whether or not that counts as science fiction or fantasy.
It's science fantasy.
It very much is. It's the whole point with Numenera is to blur the lines to the point where trying to argue one way or the other is pointless.
It's a perfect blending of Clarke's third law with Clarke's third law corollary.
I'd say it's taking both to logical extremes.
Exactly, and then blending them into a beautiful game that I love. I really love Numenera. Yeah. I really love Numenera.
I still haven't finished Torment though.
Oh, and also isn't that kind of the point behind any genre that has fantasy tacked onto it, whether it's based in medieval or futuristic sci-fi? And I will stand by this and I will defend it. The fact that it's fantasy, yes, it has groundings in what someone might be or what someone might consider believable. But at the end of the day, it's fantasy because it stretches the boundaries of what is believable just enough that it becomes fantasy. Mm-hmm. It is kind of a fine line. And I'm going to use Game of Thrones again as an example. Well, within the world of Game of Thrones, a normal person's not going to walk into a fire and then walk out unscathed. But within the setting of Game of Thrones, the way that they've developed the world and the way they've presented it, yeah, it's not necessarily the most believable thing in the world. But within the context of the world that has been built, that has been presented to us, I do believe that someone could actually walk into a funeral pyre and then come out with 3 dragons. That makes sense, and that's what makes it fantasy. It would in our normal boring world, we know that's obviously not going to happen. But within the context of the world of Game of Thrones, it actually does make sense.
That does
Well,
tie into why I've stressed that believability is more important than realism. But where were you going to go with Xana?
I was going to say, and the part that makes it believable is the addition of the fantastic elements. You can't have that unbelievable thing such as walking into a funeral pyre, coming out unscathed with 3 objects. You can't make that believable without some sort of fantastic element in play, and that fantastic element is the underpinning for fantasy, which is why Numenera, going back to that, was science fantasy, because the whole point is Earth has gone through 8 ages of hyper technological advancement and collapse, and you're now in the 9th world, where all of this hyper technology has collapsed and combined, become these conglomerates where you don't really understand all of the science, and some of the science is extremely malignant. The clouds of nanobots that randomly mutate people, but to the people of the 9th world, it's magic that if you don't use the proper relics to keep yourself safe, you're going to be horribly changed forever.
Actually, a really good example is Blue Gender in the very first episode, where I woke up, yeah, everything's gonna be normal until that giant bug busts through the wall and kills the person that just saved you, and all of a sudden now you realize, yeah, this is not. We're not in Kansas anymore, boys and girls. And you have essentially presented to whoever is watching the show or whoever's actually living in this god awful reality. Yeah, everything's fine and dandy until you realize that your world has actually changed. In the instance of Blue Gender, the big bug shows up and it gets shot by a giant mech, and it's like, okay, come with us. Yes, now it's actually believable, but it's not so much. It's not so much an extreme where the bug doesn't just exist. You don't know that the world has changed. You don't know that the world has been destroyed and the rules of the game aren't the same. But it does present you with a certain situation where you have to come to terms or come to realization that crap, big mechs, giant bugs, okay, the rules have changed and it's believable.
It also doesn't hurt that in something like Blue Gender, it's made very clear that yeah, everything is fucked. Have a nice day.
Oh yeah, Blue Gender actually does do a very good job of presenting you with the idea that the entire world is not only has it gone to shit, but it's been screwed for years and years and years, and you're just the unfortunate person that woke up to this absolutely terrifying world. Mm-hmm. But what it does do well, and this is my point, in that first episode, it's just enough to set the stage that you can believe it, but it doesn't overstep its boundaries where you think it's not believable.
Which I can definitely see that. When now getting back to the whole concept with fantasy, I think given all that we had mentioned, where would you say the line is drawn, given how we've defined fantasy so far, between that and science fiction?
Well, without using anime as an example, the movie Reign of Fire. I think that's the best blend of realism and fantasy, because Reign of Fire does do a very good job of presenting the fact that dragons exist. And yeah, it might sound crazy, but here you go. Dragons.
Mhm.
It actually does work. And that the where I would draw the line is it has to be believable. It can't just appear out of nowhere. It can't be like all of a sudden, hey, Zan, Mildra, by the way, I'm a mage. I'm going to snap my fingers and Cthulhu's going to pop out. No one's going to believe that. But as far as a fire-breathing lizard, maybe it could exist. I have a PhD. I'm going to take this egg from a civilization. I'm going to incubate it. I'm going to see if it actually hatches. I'm going to study it. And oh, by the way, now I just hatched a dragon, and boom, there we go. That's the mother. There has to be some degree of believability to it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the line between fantasy and science fiction, again, overlaps between these genres occur pretty commonly, only because introducing fantastical elements into something is a good way to get around normal science rules. But, for example, I would argue that Mass Effect, the video games, excluding Andromeda because that's an entirely different can of worms, Mass Effect, up until the very end, was pretty much sci-fi, not science fantasy, because every mechanism was explained with the introduction of one non-real element. There, on the Mohs hardness science scale, they would be pretty high up on the hardness there, because they introduced one new physical element, element 0, and then a whole bunch of physics phenomena that spring forth from this element. And those physics phenomena explain biotics, they explain Omnigel, they explain faster than light travel, they explain all the new weaponry. EZO itself was the source scientifically for all of these other things that were then included scientifically, especially the biotics. Which most people would say, but that's just psychic powers, that's fantasy, there you go, science fantasy. I always go, no, they have to use EZO to shape biotic fields. That's required. Without EZO, they can't do that. So at that point, it's all tied to the actual element 0. And if element 0 ceased to exist entirely in the Mass Effect universe, the Mass Effect universe could no longer function. There wouldn't be a Mass Effect universe. And there's no fantastical element to just bring it right back into where it was. It's very, very hard set into its scientific mindset, and that is why it is a science fiction game rather than a science fantasy game. Going to the typical examples of science fantasy in media, most people would say Star Wars, although as we've discussed, that actually borders on space opera. Mm-hmm. But that's because the Force, yes, the Force is a force that flows through everybody and everyone and exists everywhere, etc., etc. But that just, all it does is it turns Force sensitives and Force users into wizards. They're well, not wizards, I would say scions. They're all fucking scions. They all use psionics of some sort.
Yeah.
And that would also, the people who aren't Force sensitive or even Force blank, they're blanks. They're the people who are psionically inactive and inert. The Yuzong Vong, they're psychic eaters, essentially. Or if you look at later Star Trek, it's science fantasy, because the Q continuum says that they're just so hyper advanced they know how to use fifth dimensional fuckery to do stuff. But then Arthur Clarke's third law applies. Any science that is significantly advanced enough is indistinguishable from magic. What the Q does, they never explain the mechanism or even make an attempt to. It's just Q can do bullshit with reality because we said so. That's all they say, and that's a fantastic element at that point. That's no longer in the harder science. It's, I can do this. I don't gotta explain shit. It's the Dungeon Master all over again. It's magic. I ain't gotta explain shit.
Although fortunately for us, for all the power that the Q continuum has, they're not immune to the language of punch.
Not immune to the language of punch, and the only one that likes to fuck with humans is John Delancey. So,
well, and Zan actually brings up a really good point in regards to, and not just science fantasy or science fiction, but just in regards to any type of story that is not nonfiction. You have to establish a certain set of rules, and you have to make it believable, and you can't violate those rules once you have established that world. So, in the sense of, like Star Wars, we've established that the Force is a thing. So, it's not unbelievable that someone can lift an X-Wing out of a swamp, because we've already established that the Force does exist. But you have to make it believable within the rules and parameters of the world that has been established. And you can't break those rules, because as soon as you start breaking the pre-established rules, you have to start coming up with an explanation as to why those rules have been broken.
Ray Sue, anybody?
Exactly. It's and that's where a lot of mediums actually really start failing, is because yes, we have this universe that might be fantasy, but yes, we realize, again, magic doesn't exist. People can't just make fireballs out of thin air unless they have a reason to do so. It's when you start breaking those rules and it doesn't make sense, then people start questioning it, and it breaks down the entire world itself, and then people start questioning it, and then you end up with, it's sort of like with the last season of Game of Thrones, where it stops making sense because you broke the rules that the world is already established. And that's the problem I see with a lot of fantasy in this instance, and also why I think it's somewhat ridiculous that people are saying Final Fantasy is getting back to its roots. What roots? Final Fantasy has always been about, yes, fantastical stories that only focus around certain characters, but unless you establish the world and the rules that the characters within that world have to operate in, people are going to look at it and go, yeah, but no. Because it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. And that's all. And I think another thing that you kind of touched on is the fact that a lot of people have the idea that because it's fantasy that you can do just about anything. Especially bad writers think this, and this is the reason why it's important to have a set of rules to build around.
Oh yeah, you're 100% correct on that, because even you can make something as fantastical as you want, but you have to establish that rule set, because if you don't, I believe the popular term amongst writers is it's an ass pull. Mm-hmm. Because I wrote myself into a corner and my protagonist is about to die, but suddenly he gets magic powers and he just leveled up by 100. No, people aren't going to buy that.
Deus Ex Machina is the name of the term. And it comes all the way back from Greek stage plays.
Yep, got in the machine. Um, but if there's any takeaway from the whole thing, is that fantasy is a very wide net, and like with a lot of things, if you focus on just the pop culture stereotype of it, there is so much that you are missing out on. That we could do. We could list off examples and for months on end and still not crack the surface.
Oh, and that's why the genre of fantasy is so great. Is because you don't have to. I know European fantasy is the go-to, but you don't have to just focus on European fantasy. The pick mythology, whether it's Maya, whether
Why
it's
do you think I'm so interested in Onyx Equinox?
Yeah.
oh no, yeah, and that's a great example. You don't have to just focus on one particular mythology or religion. You can look at pretty much whatever has been created throughout human history and turn it into a fantasy story. It doesn't have to be European style, Dungeons and Dragons, swords and sorcery. You can pick. Honestly, I would really like to see Nobunga. I forget his name.
Nobunaga.
Yeah, Nobunaga. I would love to see a lot more people actually focus on Far East mythology and not only juxtapose it against history. Who doesn't want to see Musashi go against a Tengu? We've seen instances of Far Eastern stories be translated into Western stories that have been extremely successful and very compelling. Look at 47 Samurai, I believe it was.
47
Ronin.
47 Ronin. Yeah, look at 47 Ronin. That's not a Western story. That's been an Eastern story for a long time. But look at how successful that was. And they didn't change much from the original story. Granted, yeah, they threw flair and obviously have Western actors, but the story itself maintained essentially the same key points, the key elements. Didn't change much. Hey, hell, look at House of Flying Daggers. Look at Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Those aren't Western stories, but they still have very fantastical elements. I would say they're fantasy. Look at what happens in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and literally the type of movie that many of those are known as wuxia or shansha, and the sha in those words means hero. Wuxia means martial hero.
Mm-hmm.
And Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is a classic example that came to the West of wuxia films. But they're very much fantasy. The Chinese acknowledge them as fantasy. They are sorted into the fantasy genre because humans cannot run on the top of bamboo. That's not a thing.
Yeah.
Oh,
But
exactly.
These humans can. But these humans can because they've trained and honed themselves to be at one with whatever they might be at one with, to make their martial skills able to allow them to run like the wind on top of the bamboo.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and that's exactly my point. Is you don't need people throwing fireballs and wearing pointy hats to create a fantasy story. You can have something like House of Flying Daggers, where no one can do this, but within the context. Oh, God.
Kung Fu Hustle counts. It's a fantasy.
He's right, and I hate it.
Don't choke to death on your booze. Come on now.
Yeah, I was trying to drink a beer right when that came out.
You know what we call that, Doku? We call that alcohol abuse. You just abused the alcohol. Shame.
But
I hate all of you.
Get to the back of the line.
The pun master is in the house. Have a punny time.
I don't know why I signed up for this.
You didn't. You barged in like you always do.
Hey, at least this time I was on time.
Thank God for small favors.
Or should we say him being on time is his own curse?
Jury's
Why
out.
not both?
Jury's out on that.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. But with that in mind, I think that's gonna do it for this particular episode of GeekWatch, and we'll be back here next week with something sort of related to this, but a little bit different. Now, I do have a couple interviews lined up, but I don't have nearly as many interviews lined up as I did last month. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing, I'll leave up to you.
Probably the holiday season. Everybody wants to be with their families and stuff.
Or as much as people are allowed to. Although I look forward to seeing all the people butthurt about people breaking bullshit guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be like what happened in San Francisco during the 4th of July all over again. Like you're gonna tell people not to light up fireworks on the 4th of July.
Good luck.
Lord knows you're gonna need it.
In California, of all places.
But that being said, I do have something planned for Thursday. I do have something planned for Saturday and Sunday, and next week we'll be doing a little bit of world building. I'm still waiting on some sort of update regarding the D&D Tarot, but there's going to be some other stuff planned that I think everybody will have some fun with. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty.